We were all just getting ready to look forward to an exciting end to the travel year for 2021 until this guy showed up. Omicron is here, and that means that travel restrictions around the world have started to come back. In this month's update to When Can We Travel, let's talk about all of the latest travel restrictions you need to know here in Canada, down in the United States, and globally as a result of the Omicron variant's emergence. We'll also touch upon some of the larger patterns around how travel is likely to shape up in 2022 and beyond. And without further ado, let's get started. We'll begin with the new travel restrictions here in Canada, which were rolled out over two separate steps over the past 2 weeks or so. At first, when Omicron was first emerging out of the southern African countries, Canada slapped a travel ban on 7 southern African countries: South Africa, Botswana, Mozambique, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and Eswatini. And then a few days later, 3 more countries were added to the list: Egypt, Nigeria, and Malawi. If you've been in one of these 10 countries over the past 14 days, then you cannot enter Canada as a foreign national. And if you're returning as a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, then you do have to complete an on-arrival test, another test on day 8, and a full 14 days of quarantine at home. What's more, it was originally announced that the pre-flight testing requirement would have to be completed at your last point of departure before your flight to Canada. Since there are no direct flights from these southern African countries to Canada, this meant that more often than not, you'd have to take another test at your layover point like Frankfurt or London as you come back to Canada, adding significant cost and time to the whole journey. Now, just this past weekend, Canada added some exemptions to these rules for accredited labs in South Africa specifically, where you can still do a test within 48 hours and use it to enter Canada. However, the blanket travel ban on African countries still strikes me as fairly reactionary and even a little bit discriminatory, considering that the Omicron variant is already around the world, including within our borders here in Canada already. But the new restrictions don't stop there. In addition to the reactionary and discriminatory elements, they're also very poorly thought out, as we saw with Canada's new rules around on-arrival testing for international travelers. Now, the first thing you need to know about these new on-arrival testing requirements is that it applies to international arrivals except for those coming from the United States, where I guess there's no Omicron variant at all. That's not really the case, of course. Omicron has been detected in the US. Instead, I'm sure there's some element of economic protection to this policy of only applying on-arrival testing to travelers except from the US. Now, if you're arriving into Canada from an international destination, then you will need to be tested at the airport upon your arrival and self-isolate until you get a negative result. There are, however, quite a few questions about how this policy will actually be implemented. When the policy was first announced, no details were really made clear about where exactly travelers who had connecting domestic flights would take their test and self-isolate. Travelers didn't know whether they'd be tested at their first port of entry into Canada or at their final destination, nor where they would self-isolate, whether it's at home or at a quarantine hotel. It does very much appear, though, that international travelers will first test at their first port of entry into Canada, and then they'll be allowed to catch their domestic flights to their place of quarantine, which is their home, and complete their self-isolation there while they wait for the test results. This, of course, also speaks to the questionable effectiveness of this policy, given that somebody is allowed to take that domestic flight even while waiting for their on-arrival test results. Who knows? If they were to test positive for Omicron, they could have spread it on that domestic flight too. By the way, everything we've just said about the on-arrival testing policy applies to fully vaccinated travelers only. If you're not fully vaccinated, then you will have to stay in a designated quarantine facility while you wait for that first day's test results, and only after that can you go back to your chosen place of quarantine, most likely your home, to complete the rest of the 14-day mandatory quarantine. But then again, if you're not fully vaccinated, what are you even doing watching this When Can We Travel video? Sorry, but we mostly talk about international trips and long-haul flights here, and not road trips. So that's what you need to know about Canada reinstating travel restrictions in December 2021 after a long period of loosening those restrictions in the summer and fall. Now, I do appreciate that these restrictions are very much designed to buy us some time, given the uncertainty that the Omicron variant has caused all around the world. However, I just wish that they were less reactionary and knee-jerk in nature, and instead they were a little bit more well thought out, with travelers' best interests in mind. Now, given these new restrictions, some Canadians might choose to persist with their international trips if they're still comfortable traveling, whereas others might prefer to stick to Canada domestically and trips to the United States. After all, if you're going to the US, you don't need to do an on-arrival test upon your return. But going to the US is also a little bit less straightforward now, although it's not a major issue. That's because the US has also implemented some tighter restrictions as of late in response to the emergence of Omicron. In particular, instead of a 3-day negative test requirement before you travel, it's now a 1-day test requirement before you go to the United States. The good news, of course, is that the US accepts antigen tests instead of PCR tests, which are often cheaper and have a much faster turnaround time. So even though it's now 1 calendar day before you travel that you must take this test, it should still be eminently possible for Canadian travelers to fulfill this requirement, whether you're going to an in-person testing clinic or you're using, let's say, the Switch Health antigen test kit where you administer the antigen test on your own. So even though the US has taken a few extra precautions, it shouldn't necessarily affect your winter travel plans as long as you're still comfortable traveling with the Omicron variant floating around. However, the same can't be said for other countries around the world, some of which have reversed course on some of their reopening plans that we saw this fall, and instead have now made it more onerous to enter the country. Take the UK, for example. It was much anticipated when the UK finally relaxed their pre-flight testing requirement back in October of 2021, but sadly, they've now reneged on that this month in December, and you will once again need a negative PCR or lateral flow test within 48 hours of departing for the UK if you want to enter the country. What's more, you also have to take a negative test within the first 2 days of arrival and self-isolate until you get the results. So for anybody who's casually considering a trip to the UK this fall or winter, including myself, I've been dabbling with the idea of taking a trip to London maybe. However, that's now gotten to be a much more difficult trip to take compared to just a few weeks before we got so up close and personal with Omicron. Another example is Singapore, who had reopened to fully vaccinated travelers from select countries on October 19th through the Vaccinated Travel Lane or VTL program. But now, in addition to having to take designated VTL flights, travelers entering Singapore must also take daily COVID-19 tests on the first 7 days upon arrival. And even though I personally, again, was considering a trip to Singapore maybe in early 2022, now I'm happy to wait. I'm happy to wait until things cool down a little bit, until I don't have to take a test on the first 7 days of arriving into the country. That's just too much. Now, all that being said, I don't want this video to just be sad and depressing news, so let's end the video on a happier note and talk about my outlook for how travel might look like in 2022 given what's gone on towards the end of 2021. The first thing to realize is that it turns out that there are some sensible governments around the world. For example, Switzerland and Japan had both implemented fairly strict travel restrictions, but they soon walked back those restrictions once Omicron was detected in the country and once they realized that the travel restrictions were likely overkill, considering that they probably weren't too effective in stopping the spread anyway. So there are countries out there who are looking for that balance between managing the transmission of COVID-19 and especially new variants with the reality of having to live with COVID in the long run and not imposing too strict of requirements if they're unwarranted. And what's more, based on the early signals of the Omicron variant that we know so far, it does seem to be more encouraging than discouraging in terms of the actual virulence of the Omicron variant. And so I'm hopeful that in a few weeks' time, when we have all the information, it will prove to be the case that the worst case scenario that we had feared isn't really what's true with Omicron. Instead, that is more of a milder variant that we can live with moving forward into 2022. However, no matter what happens going into next year, I do think that this episode with the Omicron variant is a valuable reminder that travel restrictions can pop up and countries can close their borders at a moment's notice, as we saw that Friday a few weeks ago when Omicron was first getting serious. If you're traveling internationally in 2022 or even the next few years, that's always going to be a reality that you must keep in mind, that perhaps you'll just have to be able to book the next flight on the way home or face the potential of quarantine, getting stuck on a plane on the tarmac, or general uncertainty no matter where you are in the world. To answer the question of when can we travel one last time in 2021, The full resumption of global travel that we're all hoping for probably isn't going to be a thing for another few years, and that's just the reality that we as avid travelers are going to have to live with as we try our best to explore the globe in the intervening period. I hope you enjoyed this video and you found the information helpful despite the downbeat nature of the news. If so, go ahead and hit the like button down below and subscribe to the Prince of Travel YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button below the video. Don't forget that you can always check out our Travel During COVID-19 resource geared towards Canadians over on princeoftravel.com. And let me know in the comments what you make of these travel restrictions. Do you agree with me that they've been half-hearted and reactionary? Or do you think these travel restrictions have been smart and well implemented? I mean, controversial take, but go ahead and pop it there in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Let's see if we can get all of these off the top of my head. Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Lesotho. No, before we got to know Omicron so up and personal.